All right, we're live and recording. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for our MindCORE seminar series. My name is Heather Calvert. I'm the Executive Director for MindCORE. When Jeff starts to speak, I'll just post a little bit more information about MindCORE for anybody who is new and doesn't know too much about us, but I don't want to take up any time from Jessie because she gives a great talk. She really blew our socks off last year when she came to give a job talk to be a MindCORE fellow. I was completely in awe. And so I think that you will find that her work is fascinating and she has an amazing command of it. And we look forward to seeing where she goes next, but not too soon, hopefully. So let me just turn over for introductions to Professor Jeff Goodwin.
Okay, thanks, Jessie, and welcome. Welcome,
I'm sorry.
Everybody.
I completely forgot to talk about the question piece. I'm so sorry, Jeff.
Okay, sure.
I apologize, everyone. Just a little bit of how-to on how this works. If you have any problems, just kind of general questions, you're welcome to post them in the chat, and you're welcome to clap in the chat or whatever you would like. If there's another article that's related to the work, you can post a link to it. But if you have a question for our speaker, it's helpful to use the Ask a Question box. And you can see when questions appear there will be sort of a little number count, and other attendees can actually upvote on questions in there. And that will assure that questions that are voted highly are asked at the end. So post your questions there. Now, I'm sorry, my part's done. Jeff.
Okay, great. Thank you, Heather. And thanks everyone for coming. So I'm really delighted to introduce Jessie Sun as our speaker today. Jessie is originally from Auckland in New Zealand, which is where she grew up. And then she left New Zealand to obtain her undergraduate degree from the University of Melbourne in Australia, where she graduated in 2015 with first-class honours. From there, she went to the University of California, Davis, where she was advised by Samin Vizier and graduated in 4 years in 2020, last year. Penn had to compete hard to get Jessie as a MindCORE postdoc, as she had numerous other excellent offers to consider last year. And we were very fortunate that we managed to secure her in the end. And she's been a MindCORE fellow since the middle of last year. Jessie's research concerns two main topics, the study of well-being and the study of morality. And her work on both of those topics is characterized by studying people outside of standard laboratory contexts. And already she's published an immensely impressive array of articles in top journals, including JPSP, JEP General, and Psychological Science, to name a few, and some of those journals multiple times. Jessie's postdoc is actually her third significant stay at Penn. She was an undergrad exchange student in the spring of 2014. Then in the fall of 2018, she visited my lab for 6 months, and now she's back again in 2020, and we're delighted to have her. And I can say from my perspective that the collaboration I've had with Jessie was one of the most remarkable collaborations I've been part of. So our research concerned whether people want to become more moral, and the shorter answer is that they don't particularly. And it was probably longer than this, but it felt like it was about 6 months from our very first conversation to our paper appearing in Psychological Science. And this is testament to Jessie's rare combination of both incredible intellectual horsepower and extreme efficiency. And I can say for sure that Jessie is definitely the most efficient person I've ever worked with, and has this awesome array of statistical, technical, methodological know-how. And in addition, she's an extremely brilliant thinker, which I think is her standout attribute as an academic. So I'm sure we'll see both of those qualities on display today, and I'm delighted to introduce Jessie.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for that very generous introduction. It is such a great pleasure to be back at Penn, and I'm really excited to share my work with you today. So caring about the opinion of others is sometimes seen as an obstacle to self-expression and self-fulfillment. For example, inspirational quotes proclaim that your life isn't yours if you always care what others think, that happiness is truly not caring what others think of you, and even that other people's opinion of you is none of your business. An alternative perspective is that others sometimes know things about us that we don't even know about ourselves, and that we need feedback from other people in order to improve. So, although I acknowledge that there are some downsides of caring too much about what others think, I think there are also some pretty good reasons for why we should be at least a little bit curious about what other people think of us. So my talk today is structured around 3 premises for why we should care about what other people think of us. The first premise is that we have some blind spots. To illustrate this point, I'll present a study that suggests that people might have some blind spots about how kind they're being in the moment.
Jessie, let me just interrupt. We can't see slides. I'm not sure if you...
Oh, wonder why that stopped sharing. Let me try that again. Okay, I'll be good.
I can see them now, yep.
Great. All right. The second premise is that other people have a unique perspective on where we have room for improvement. To substantiate this point, I'll present 2 studies that show that friends are more attuned to people's flaws in the prosocial and moral domains, and that close others have different ideas about how a person could best improve their personalities compared to what that person wants to change about themselves. And finally, I'll end up with a proposal for testing a third premise, that honest feedback could be a pathway to self-knowledge and self-improvement. So let's get started with this first premise, that people have some blind spots. In this study, we were looking at the bigger question of whether people know what they're like in the moment. We looked at a few different behaviors, but for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on kindness because this is the most interpersonally important behavior that we measured. So I want to start with an intuition pump. And at this stage, I'd like to invite you to go to this website and use this code, which Heather will drop into the chat, to participate in a poll. And while I share 2 audio recordings with you, I'd like you to consider whether the participant in each recording was being kind or rude. So now I'm going to share the audio with you. Okay, so what I'm going to play you are 2 audio recordings of real participants with their permission. So here's the first clip.
I think my sister might have made it on, especially because my brother her twin brother didn't have her in his wedding, which is such bullshit.
Wow.
Yeah.
Why?
He his wife just had her own maid of honor. It didn't even have to be a maid of honor. It could have been a bridesmaid. That's a typical thing. You let your siblings.
I barely know my older sister. She's definitely gonna be my bridesmaid.
Yeah,
Okay, so that was the first clip, and here is the second one.
Decision ever, because we would not have worked. It just wasn't going to work. Because I was his first serious relationship. We were both each other's first love. We thought it was perfect, and it wasn't. But we thought it was. And then I can tell you, trust me, breaking up helps. And you have a good support system here. If it goes wrong. And you can come into Lummy and Mel's room. We can have a glass of wine.
I don't know if I would miss that.
All right, so I want to give you just a moment to go to this site and submit your vote, and we'll come back to this at the end of this section. Okay, so there are 2 ways that we can think about what our blind spots are. One way that we could have blind spots is about what we're like overall as people. So a personality trait is defined as how a person typically thinks, feels, and behaves. So the corresponding form of self-knowledge is whether people know what they're like in general. Work on self-knowledge has primarily focused on this kind of self-knowledge of whether you know what you're like overall. But what we don't know really is whether people know what they're like in the moment. So another way that you can think about self-knowledge is whether people know how they were acting across a shorter period of time, how they were thinking, feeling, and acting over a shorter period of time. And this is the form of self-knowledge that I'll be considering today. I argue that this kind of self-knowledge is important because in order to truly know ourselves, it's important to know not only that we can sometimes be a jerk, but also to know precisely when and to be able to catch ourselves in that moment. So just to give you an illustration of the practical importance of momentary self-insight, imagine that one morning you're late to work, and as you rush out the door in this frazzled state, you tell your romantic partner to get out of your face. So obviously that's not very nice, but what happens next might depend on whether you noticed how he just acted. If you immediately realize that you just acted like a jerk, you might be able to learn from this experience and learn about what triggers your momentary rudeness and potentially be able to improve in the future. And importantly, you'll be able to apologize immediately before any resentment brews. But if you go on with the rest of your day, oblivious to what you did because you've been distracted about your upcoming day at work, you may have missed this important opportunity to improve and to learn about yourself. And if you fail to apologize because you didn't notice, this could result in further relational harm. So I haven't tested these downstream consequences, but this is what I would theorize would be the role of momentary self-insight, and it's why I think it's important. So how can we measure self-insight? We need to compare how people think they're behaving in the moment with how they're actually acting in the moment. It's straightforward enough to measure what people think they're acting like in the moment. We can use the experience sampling method, which involves sending people surveys multiple times each day in their everyday lives for several days. And in each survey, we might ask people questions like, from 11 a.m. till noon, how considerate and kind were you? And how rude were you? So this is how we might measure how kind a person thinks they're acting in the moment. What is less straightforward is how we measure how people are actually acting in the moment. This is the biggest challenge in self-knowledge research, and it's called the criterion problem. How do we establish what people are actually like? I argue that an ideal criterion should capture a broad range of people's behaviors in their natural environments, and preferably be done in a way that's unobtrusive, so we don't change people's natural behaviors. In this study, we use the only method that we know of that meets all of these criteria, and that's the electronically activated recorder, or the ear. The ear is an iPod Touch or a smartphone that is programmed to record 30-second or 50-second sound snippets every 10 or 15 minutes during people's waking hours. So it basically records everything that a person is saying and doing that can be that is audible to a microphone as they're going about their everyday lives. These recordings are then coded by multiple human coders in the lab, which results in intensive, repeated, and consensual observer-based ratings of what people are actually like in their everyday lives. And the two audio recordings that I played for you at the start of a section were recordings from an ear study that I'll be presenting right now. So the data that I'll be presenting come from the personality and interpersonal role study PAIRS, which was a 7-wave longitudinal study of 434 college students at Washington University.
Jessie, I don't know if you can hear me, but your audio feed is dropped out.
How about in the audience? Does anybody hear Jessie, or is she frozen for everyone? Maybe we're all frozen.
No. Okay, Jessie's refreshing.
Okay, good. Oh my. Yeah, okay.
Okay, sorry about the technical issues.
No worries. So we don't have your slides again, so you'll need to pull them up.
I'm sharing them now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right.
So we left off on just on the slide before the one.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, great. So as I was saying, The data that I'll be presenting come from the Personality and Interpersonal Role Study, PAIRS, which was a longitudinal multi-method study of 434 college students at Washington University in St. Louis. I'll be presenting some data from Wave 1, but I do want to note that this is a very rich data set that includes informant reports, ear data, and as well as experience sampling data. So I invite people to check out the code books if they're interested in free data. So to measure what people thought they were like in the moment, we use the experience sampling method, and we asked people 4 times a day to report how considerate, kind they were in the past hour, as well as how rude they thought they were. And this is how we measured momentary kindness. We also included 2 items to measure momentary extroversion, and these were outgoing, sociable, and quiet. I'm including extroversion because it's an example of another observable social behavior, but one that is less clearly socially desirable compared to kindness, so it'll make for an interesting comparison. To measure what people were actually like in the moment, we used the ear, which was programmed to record 30-second sound snippets every 9.5 minutes. Observers in the lab then listened to these recordings. Specifically, they listened to the 6 sound files that matched the same hour that participants themselves reported on. For example, if they reported from 11 a.m. till 12 p.m., our coders in the lab listened to the 6 files recorded from 11 a.m. till 12 p.m. And then they formed a holistic judgment of how rude or kind and considerate that participant seemed during that hour. To get enough inter-rater reliability, we had 6 coders per participant. And this is why it took hundreds of research assistants and many years to complete. So to summarize, we measured how people thought they were acting in the moment using experience sampling self-reports. And we compared these self-perceptions with their actual behavior in the moment as measured by observer reports from ear recordings. We ended up with 2,519 observations from 217 participants. And I should note that these observations are only from time points when participants were interacting with others, because it's not relevant to measure to say how rude or kind you were if you weren't involved in an interaction. Before I proceed to the results, I want to quickly note what kind of accuracy we're looking at. There are different ways you can think about accuracy, but the kind of accuracy we were interested in is tracking accuracy. And the question here is, can people judge when they're being more or less kind compared to their other moments? To make this more concrete, here's some fake data from a hypothetical participant. Imagine that each of these data points correspond to one of a participant's time points. On the x-axis, they have self-reported kindness. And on the y-axis is their actual level of kindness. And you see that there's no correspondence at all between what they think they're doing and how they're actually acting. But there are 2 different ways you can achieve high tracking accuracy. You could have a situation where a participant reports a level of kindness that is exactly the same as their actual level of kindness. But you can also have high levels of tracking accuracy, even if overall people are overestimating their kindness. So for tracking accuracy, it doesn't matter whether people are overestimating or underestimating. It just matters that they know when they're being more or less kind compared to their other moments. So to proceed to the main result, do people know when they're being kind? I'm going to show you the results for extroversion and kindness side by side. And just to orient you to this figure, on the x-axis, we have people's self-reported levels of extroverted behavior and kindness. These are within person-centered, such that positive scores correspond to times when a person thinks that they're acting more extroverted or more kind than their usual levels. And negative scores mean they thought that they were being less extroverted or less kind than usual. And the y-axis shows the full range of their actual behavior as reported by observers. So for this figure, every blue line shows an individual person's slope, and the black line shows the overall average effect. And what we can see is that clearly people know how extroverted they're acting in the moment. When people say that they're acting more extroverted than usual, observers tend to agree to a huge extent. So do we see the same thing for kindness? We see a much smaller amount of agreement for kindness. So this is still more than 0, but it's definitely much less agreement than what we see for extroverted behavior. So our interpretation of this finding is that it suggests that people might not know when they're being more or less kind, at least not to the same extent that they know when they're being more or less extroverted. One question you might have at this point is, could it be that the observers are wrong? Because when two measures of a construct disagree, it's possible that either the self-report is wrong or the observers are wrong. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to show you the results for extroversion, because extroverted behavior is another example of an observable interpersonal behavior that is primarily defined by overt behavior. And we think that kindness is also something that should be primarily defined by behavior. So we didn't really have any reason to believe that observers would be any worse at judging kindness than they would be at judging someone's extroverted behavior. We also think that kindness is something that is more interpersonally defined and that other people have a more valid perspective and that their opinion matters more. But you might not be convinced by all of this. So one other solution that one other piece of evidence that we've tried to use to triangulate is to consider people's transcripts from those times when observers and the self disagreed. So now I'm going to turn to the poll that I posed to you at the start of this section, where I asked you whether the participant who was complaining about someone who didn't have her in his wedding, which is such bullshit, and whether a second participant who was consoling a friend having relationship issues, whether these participants were being relatively kind or rude. So the big reveal. Okay, good. As predicted, most of you thought that the first participant was being relatively rude and that the second participant was being relatively kind. And this is actually also what the ear observers thought. So in the first case, the participant themselves thought that they were being much more kind than usual, but the observers thought that they were being relatively rude. And the second participant thought they were being relatively rude, whereas the second participant, the ear observers, thought that person was being much more kind than they usually were in that moment.
Jessie, if you don't mind, there's just a couple of questions of clarification that I thought might be best to ask now.
Yeah, sure.
One of those is, did you define kindness for the coders?
No, but they relied on their own understanding of what it means to be considerate, kind, and rude.
Okay. And then the other one is, it looks like the range of scores for kindness is much smaller than the range for extroversion. And the question is whether that could play into differences in effect sizes.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. This is a valid concern. One response is there, so the main concern would be, are there ceiling effects? If there are ceiling effects, then that would attenuate any effect size that we would get. The way that I've tried to resolve this is we use multi-level structural equation modeling to account for differences in reliability between extroverted behavior and kindness. If it were the case that we saw ceiling effects, that would be reflected in reduced reliability. But with multi-level structural equation modeling, we can account for differences in reliability. So it doesn't seem to be the case that there are ceiling effects where we're not seeing any variation. Another response I have to that concern is that I think that it could be part of a mechanism that if someone's range of kindness is much smaller than their range for extroverted behavior, it's easier for you to notice when you're being quiet versus loud and talkative than it is for you to notice the more subtle variations in kindness. So that could be part of a mechanism.
Great.
Okay, but I just want to wrap up on this point, which is that obviously these are two highly cherry-picked examples I'm just showing you for illustration, but we've actually made the transcripts available for the 50 or so time points where we saw the biggest discrepancies between people's self-reported kindness and what the ear observers said. And we've done this in the spirit of trying to encourage people to read the transcripts themselves to get a sense of what's going on and to form their own conclusions. But overall, this, of course, isn't the last word on momentary self-insight. But to the extent that the consensual perspective of several observers captures something meaningful about what we really like in the moment, these findings suggest that people might have some blind spots about their momentary kindness. One reaction you might have at this point is that this study featured the perspective of disinterested observers in the lab. You might argue that what we really want to know is what the people in our lives who are involved in these interactions think of us. So in part 2 of this talk, I'll consider the perspective of the people who we have valued relationships with, friends and other close relational partners. In this part of the talk, I'll split it into two parts. In the first part, I'll ask a question of what friends most like and dislike about your personality. And in the second part, what your friends and other close others would most want to change about your personality. So let's start with part one. Personality psychologists have traditionally focused more on describing people's personalities than on evaluating whether their personalities are good or bad. But people do have opinions about which traits are good or bad in themselves and in others. And it's really important to understand which traits are highly desirable or undesirable, because these are the traits that we care the most about in ourselves and in others. In the first type of study that's been done in the past, people have rated the likability or the desirability of hundreds of different traits. But in practice, many extremely desirable or undesirable traits might be rare. So those traits that are rated as being highly undesirable or desirable in the abstract might not be the traits that people most like and dislike about actual real people. In the second type of study in the past, researchers have asked people to describe the traits of people who they like or dislike, or to describe the positive or negative traits of people who they know. But existing studies along these lines have focused on the quantitative properties of these descriptors, like how many distinct words people use, instead of focusing on their content. And finally, past research has also looked at which traits are associated with having positive impressions of others. But again, which traits are associated with liking others, for example, isn't the same as knowing which traits are considered to be most desirable or undesirable. To our knowledge, no study has addressed the question of which traits are most desirable or undesirable in real people. Answering this question could shed light on which personality characteristics people care the most about in practice. And in addition, the desirability of a trait could be partially in the eye of a beholder. For example, some traits could be especially good for the self, but neutral for others, or they might even be good for the self, but bad for others, and vice versa. So for this part of the talk, I have two questions. The first question is, which traits do people most like and dislike about themselves and their friends? And the second is, to what extent do your friends agree with you on what your best and worst traits are? To answer these questions, I use data from 3 samples of college students who I'll call targets. These targets responded to 2 questions about what their 2 best traits were and what their 2 worst traits were. And we asked them in slightly different ways for samples 1 compared to samples 2 and 3. But in each case, we asked them to report 2 best traits and 2 worst traits. Each of these targets also had informants who reported on what that person's 2 best traits and 2 worst traits were. For example, they might say, we might ask them, what do you most like or what do you like most about Samin's personality? And in all cases, we used data from 1 friend informant. So these sample sizes reflect the number of friend and target pairs. So which traits do people most like and dislike about themselves and their friends? I just want to give you a sense of what kinds of traits people were reporting. These are the top 50 most frequently mentioned best and worst traits that were reported by the self and by friends. But of course, our main goal here was to more systematically categorize what kinds of traits people were mentioning and to summarize them. So to do so, we coded each of these open-ended responses into the high or low poles of major trait domains. In sample 1, we coded them into high or low levels of a big 5, which is a widely accepted taxonomy for summarizing the main dimensions of personality that people differ on. For example, examples of high extroversion would be friendly, outgoing, or enthusiastic.
You're frozen again, Jessie. Can people just comment if that's happening for them as well, just so we know? Thank you. I think Jessie will refresh.
All right, am I back?
You're back.
Thank you for your patience. Okay, so where did I leave off? I'm gonna assume I left off.
Yeah, you were just, it was only a little bit that we missed.
Okay,
You were talking
great.
us through extroversion.
Okay, so these are examples of high or low extroverted best or worst traits. We did the same thing for agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness. So this is just to give you a sense of which traits go under which categories. For samples 2 and 3, we also further decided to code these traits into high or low levels of honesty, humility, which has been proposed to be a major sixth factor of personality. And we made this decision to make a more fine-grained distinction between aspects of prosociality that reflect high levels of kindness and politeness, which is captured by agreeableness, versus aspects of prosociality that are more about morality and integrity, which is captured more by honesty, humility. And finally, there were some traits that couldn't be categorized into any of these categories. And my favorite one was a person whose worst trait was imitating cats. So now I'm going to show you the results for the percentage of best traits that fell into high or low poles of each of the big 5 or big 6. And these are separated by self-reported traits and friend-reported traits. To give you an example, plus E means high extroversion and negative C means low conscientiousness. So here's what we find. The first thing to notice is that almost all of the best traits reflected the positive pole of a big 5 or the big 6. Hardly any traits were mentioned that reflected low levels of a big 5 or big 6. So this suggests that there's only really one way you can have a best trait, which is to be high on these big 5 or big 6 domains. When we average across the 3 samples and across self and friend reports, we see that the most frequently mentioned best trait was high agreeableness. So both people and their friends seem to be valuing kindness and considerateness as being best traits. And finally, overall, we saw that friends in the self were emphasizing pretty similar kinds of best traits. There really weren't that many self-other asymmetries in the types of best traits that people themselves and their friends were mentioning. There were a few, but they weren't consistent across the 3 samples, so I consider this to be suggestive. Turning to worst traits, the most interesting finding that really stood out to me was that even though the majority of worst traits reflected the negative pole of a big 5 or the big 6, there was a non-trivial percentage of worst traits that also reflected the positive pole of a big 5 or big 6. So what this suggests is that there's more than one way that you can have a worst trait. And specifically, what I thought this suggested is that having too much of a good thing could be a mixed blessing, and that some traits could have both positive and negative consequences. So I just want to dive into this point for a moment because I think it's pretty interesting. And this phenomenon of having a mixed blessing applied to around 16 to 17% of participants. And this was a percentage of participants who either had a self or friend reported best trait, that was reflecting the same broad trait domain as a self or friend reported worst trait. So to make this more concrete, here are some examples. For high conscientiousness, one participant said that their best trait was being perseverant, but their worst trait was being unspontaneous. So both of these reflected high conscientiousness, showing that this could be a mixed blessing for the same participant. Another example of being kind, but also a pushover, innovative, but eccentric, or enthusiastic, but also a bit of an attention seeker, and so on. So this suggests that people can spontaneously express the mixed blessings of various personality traits. To return to this main figure, the second finding to notice is that overall, the most frequently mentioned worst trait was low emotional stability. But a huge caveat here is that this seems to apply mostly for people themselves. So across all 3 samples, people themselves are more frequently mentioning low emotional stability worst traits compared to what their friends are saying their worst traits are. Friends, on the other hand, at least across 2 samples, seem to place greater emphasis on the prosocial domains of low honesty, humility, or low agreeableness. So friends seem to be more concerned about your being selfish, arrogant, and judgmental. But to summarize, what I showed is that that there's more ways to have a bad trait than a good trait, that people seem to care quite a bit about having a high levels of agreeableness in someone, and also think that low emotional stability is a common worst trait. And overall, friends seem to have more varied conceptions of what a worst trait is compared to people themselves. Specifically, friends focus less on low emotional stability and more on prosocial traits. Okay, so what I just showed you was what people themselves and their friends are reporting on average, what kinds of traits they're reporting to be best and worst traits on average. Now I wanted to turn to the question of whether individual pairs of people themselves and their friends are agreeing on what that specific person's best and worst traits are. I did this in two ways. The first way was to look at agreement on broad trait domains. And the question here is, if I reported two best traits that reflected high extroversion and high agreeableness, would my friend also report two traits that also reflected those two broad trait categories? We found that for sample one, we saw around 50% agreement between self-reported best traits and friend-reported best traits on these broad trait domains. In other words, out of the two traits that a person reported to be their best trait, their friend reported one trait on average that matched the same broad trait domain. We saw somewhat lower levels of agreement for worst traits, but still substantial. And in sample two, we also saw greater self-other agreement for best traits compared to worst traits, but this was only directional in the third sample. When you're only dealing with a few different categories, it's possible that you can get agreement just by chance. And I don't have time to go into details, but suffice to say, I ran some analyses and showed that this amount of agreement was more than what you would expect based on base rates alone. So the second way you can think about self-other agreement is not only on the broad trait category that a trait reflects, but also on which specific trait people are reporting. Because you could be highly agreeable by either being kind or being polite, and those are two different things. So to look at agreement on specific traits, we had research assistants complete a bunch of coding questions where we showed them one trait that was self-reported and then two traits that were reported by their friends, and asked them whether that self-reported trait was equal to either of the two friend-reported traits. And we repeated this procedure for both traits. So in this case, the answer is clearly yes, because too blunt matches blunt more than most people. In some cases, we also accepted various close synonyms. For example, easygoing would also be equal to very chill. So that would also be a yes. And here's an example where that self-reported trait doesn't match either of the friend-reported traits. We had 6 research assistants complete this coding task, and if at least 3 of them said that it was a match, then we coded it as being a match. So I'll show you the results for agreement on specific traits next to the agreement for broad trait categories. And what we see is that, unsurprisingly, we saw much less agreement on these specific traits. This is unsurprising because it's much harder to agree on very specific narrow traits compared to the general trait that a trait reflects. But overall, we also saw that people seem to be agreeing with their friends more on what their best traits are than what their worst traits are. We also think that this level of self-other agreement on best traits, which on average was about 20%, is quite impressive, considering that we gave people 2 empty boxes and we gave their friends 2 empty boxes, and yet they still seem to agree about 20% of the time. So overall, we found that friends agreed more on what your best traits were than what your worst traits were, and we also saw greater agreement on broad traits than on specific traits. So what we just saw in this section is that other people have somewhat different ideas about what a person's worst traits are compared to what people themselves think their worst traits are. Specifically, friends seem to be more attuned to your low prosociality and your immorality compared to what people themselves think. But does this mean that your friends would also want you to improve these prosocial and moral traits? That's what I'll turn to now in the second part of this, part 2. So I'm going to start with the premise that people care a lot about morality and about getting others to be more moral. To provide just a few examples, 96% of American parents think that developing moral character in children is very important. psychologists and educators are developing interventions to build character in kids. And business schools have business ethics classes, presumably to encourage people to become more ethical business leaders. So people care a lot about morality. And there's also another literature showing that most people want to improve themselves in some way. So I want to know whether this emphasis on morality would also emerge in the goals that people have for improving themselves and for improving other people. The answer was not obvious. On the one hand, people do highly value morality in both themselves and in other people. This would suggest that people might want to be more moral to meet their own moral standards and to reap the reputational benefits of being seen as a moral person. On the other hand, past research suggests that people typically want to change their personalities in ways that will improve their own lives. So to the extent that morality involves overcoming selfish impulses for the benefit of others, people might think that the cost of becoming more moral would outweigh its benefits. I also want to know whether other people would want us to be more moral. Because other people have a complementary perspective on our personality traits, they might also have unique insight into which of our traits are most in need of improvement. Or they might just want us to improve in ways that would benefit them. So for this part of the talk, I had three questions. Do people want to be more moral? Do close others want you to be more moral? And finally, do close others want you to change in the same ways that you do? For this study, I recruited 2 samples of participants from Penn and from UC Davis as a direct replication. Because I was interested in people's goals to change their moral character traits, I want to just quickly explain the concept of a moral character trait. Some personality traits are more morally relevant than others in that they tell you more about someone's moral character, essentially whether they're a good person or a bad person. For example, knowing that someone is anxious, creative, and sociable doesn't tell you very much information about whether they're a good person or a bad person, whereas knowing that someone is dishonest, unfair, and cruel would provide a lot more clues. So for this study, participants themselves rated their current levels on each of 21 different traits that varied in moral relevance, and they told us how much they wanted to change each trait. To measure change goals, we reworded 2 items from each to measure each of the traits as a change goal. For example, the item, I am someone who is helpful and unselfish with others, was reworded as, I want to be helpful and unselfish with others. And this time, the response scale ranges from much less than I currently am to much more than I currently am, with a midpoint of, I don't want to change on this trait. But when you measure change goals in this way, it's possible to say that you just want to be better at everything. So to get a better sense of which traits people would most want to change about themselves if they had to choose, we made them choose. And we showed them the full list of changes that they selected in the previous stage and asked them to choose the top 3 changes that they most want to see in themselves. So that's the data that I'll be showing you in this figure, where I'll show you the percentage of participants who prioritize an improvement on each of these traits on the y-axis as one of their top 3 change goals. I've ordered these traits from least morally relevant to most morally relevant, and this isn't just my idiosyncratic opinion, but instead the crowdsourced judgments of hundreds of other participants who were in the same subject pools. So, do people want to be more moral? It seems like people are overwhelmingly prioritizing goals to become less anxious and less depressed in both of these college student samples. And this was followed by goals to become more sociable, less emotionally volatile, and more productive, and pretty much anything that's not at the bottom of this list, where the moral traits are. So people don't seem to be particularly interested in prioritizing goals to become more compassionate, loyal, honest, or moral, etc. Just to hammer this home, here's a scatter plot of the moral relevance of each of the 21 traits against the percentage of participants who prioritize an improvement on each of these traits. I'll just label a few of these points so you can see where different traits are. And as you can see, clearly across both samples, people were less interested in prioritizing improvements on more morally relevant traits. So the short answer is people don't particularly want to be more moral. But do close others want you to be more moral? To answer this question, we relied on informant reports from informants that the targets had nominated. They nominated up to 4 informants each, and in practice, most people had between 1 and 2 informants. These informants answer the same questions about the target. For example, I want Jeff to be helpful and unselfish with others. And they also selected their top 3 priorities for how they wanted that person to change. So now I'm going to add the informant reported priorities. And what you can see is that, interestingly, people's informant reported priorities seem to be almost a mirror image of the ways that people would most want to change their own personalities.
Jessie, you're frozen again.
Yeah, I was hoping I thought it was a dramatic pause.
I thought it was too. I thought we were absorbing the data, but
yeah, because it was fascinating.
Okay, where was I?
You were left us staring at the data screen, and we were intensely contemplating that, and then it went on for a bit too long.
Did I get past the results?
You had just shown us the graph.
Okay, perfect. What I left you intensely contemplating was the beautiful symmetry between self-reports and informant reports of personality change priorities.
We just need your slides too, Jessie. They're not up.
So just like the targets themselves, informants seem to overwhelmingly want their targets to become less anxious and less depressed, and they aren't particularly interested in getting their targets to become more moral. So the short answer is that close others also don't particularly want you to be more moral. So now I want to turn to the final question of whether close others more generally want you to change in the same ways that you do. And this is again the question of self-other agreement between specific pairs of targets and friends, rather than average preferences for personality change. So there are different ways you can look at self-other agreement on change goals, but the way I'm going to do it is to look at the percentage of top 3 priorities that matched between the self-reported priorities and a friend's reported priorities. And this is a set of new analyses that aren't reported in the paper, so this is pretty exciting. Okay, so here's an example of where you would have a 0% agreement, where none of the priorities reported by the self matched the priorities that were reported by an informant. Here's 1 and 3, so 33%, and here's 2 and 3, so 67%. So this is the metric of self-other agreement that I'll report right now. Here, I'll show you the percentage of participants who had 0, 1, 2, or 3 matching goals between their own goals and what their informants wanted for them. And as you can see, around half of participants had 1 goal in common with their informant. And overall, we see around 30% agreement, which can be summarized as 1 and 3 traits that are matching between your own priorities and what your friends and other close others want for you. And again, I show that this was more than what you would expect just based on base rates. So there is some distinct self-other agreement between how you want to change your personalities and how your friends and family members want you to change. But clearly they have 2 different priorities than what you have for yourself. So overall, we see an average of 1 out of 3 shared priorities, which suggests that there is room for unique insight from others. So my goal in this section was to highlight the unique perspective that other people have on our worst flaws and how we could best improve ourselves. And what I showed was that close others seem to be more attuned to your prosocial and moral flaws. And even though these aren't necessarily the traits that they most want you to improve, they do have some distinct ideas for how you could improve yourself. At this point, I want to note that whether this uniqueness reflects insight per se is an open question, because other people's judgments of what your flaws are or what you should change about yourself could just reflect their personal preferences rather than any fact of the matter. But it also seems plausible that at least in some cases, your close others might truly have more insight into your blind spots, especially if multiple close others feel the same way. So I propose that at a minimum, others have a unique perspective that could be informative, and in the best case, they could potentially shine a light on your blind spots. And finally, I want to end briefly with one future direction on the prospect of improving self-knowledge through honest feedback. In the studies that I presented today, we went to great lengths to make sure that the targets never found out what their informants said about them. But what if, in the moment, a friend was able to call you out on when you were being rude, or if they told you what your flaws are, or they told you how they wish you would change? What I'm interested in finding out next is how people would react to this kind of honest feedback from others. Would this be useful, and would it result in behavioral change? There has been plenty of research on feedback in formal settings, such as 360 feedback in organizations. We don't know very much about the consequences of feedback provided by our close others in everyday life. Of course, some people might prefer to be unaware of their bad qualities, but let's just assume that some people do want to know what their close others think of them, and that could be helpful to them. In that case, a problem still is that potential feedback providers might not feel comfortable providing truly honest feedback because they're worried about damaging valued relationships. So one solution that I've come up with, along with my collaborators Ike Silver and Jeff Goodwin, is an honesty box paradigm, where we propose that anonymity could facilitate honest feedback. And I just want to give you a sense of what we have in mind here for this project we're currently planning and seeking funding for. So we're planning on getting a group of potential feedback receivers to nominate people in their lives who could provide feedback about them. And we'll randomize these feedback receivers to either receive feedback that is anonymous and critical or signed and critical. And we're interested in what percentage of providers would respond in each of these conditions. We suspect that people would be much more likely to respond if the feedback is anonymous. And we also want to know how people would receive that feedback and how they would react to it. So we'll get the participants to read the feedback that we show them in another survey and report their reactions to it, as well as the behavioral intentions, if they have any intentions to change on the basis of the feedback. And we plan to follow up after 1 week, as well as 2 months later. So to summarize, today I've made a case for why we should care about what other people think of us. We should care because we have some blind spots. For example, people might not always know how well they're treating others in the moment. We should care because close others have a unique perspective on our flaws and where we have room for improvement. And finally, although I don't yet have data to speak to this, I propose that we should also care because honest feedback could be a pathway to self-knowledge and self-improvement. So maybe next time you hear the common advice to stop caring so much about what other people think of you, you might instead have a little humility and consider the possibility that other people often have a valuable perspective on you, which, if shared, could facilitate your journey towards self-insight and self-improvement. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators, my many research assistants, and MindCORE for sponsoring this wonderful postdoc. Thank you.
So I just want to, because we lost you a couple times, and because that there's some questions here, we have a number of people online. I'd like to just check, Jeff and Jessie, are you okay to go over time a little bit?
Sure.
Yep, I'm fine with that.
Okay, good. So then just for our attendees, if you have to go somewhere, you're welcome to sign off. But Jessie will take some questions, so we'll run a little late. And if you have to go somewhere and you'd like to see answers to the questions, you can always come back and view the recording at a later date, just forward through everything to get back to the questions. So I'll turn it over.
And anyone can email me questions if they have any.
Okay, great. Well, wonderful talk, Jessie, as predicted. There's a couple of questions to start with, going back to the first section on self-knowledge. One of these questions is about possible differences in contextual dependency of kindness and extroversion. And so the suggestion here, and this is a question from Sibel Smith, is it seems like kindness might be more context dependent, in that evaluating kindness depends on knowing more about the interrelations between the parties and the background context, whereas extroversion is more able to be evaluated without that sort of contextual information. And so the question is, I guess, for you to reflect on that possibility.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a possibility, that there's more social nuance involved in knowing all of the details and the potential motivations of different people in that situation. I think that what the observer's perspective is is you can imagine like being at an office and gossiping about a colleague, and then someone walking by and hearing that conversation. That person may not have any prior context or knowledge about what you're like and what your relationships are like, but they're still in a position to form a judgment of you and to form an impression of you. So that's kind of what the observer perspective is this disinterested perspective where they don't have full knowledge of the whole context, but it's also a position that people are often in everyday life. So what would have been really interesting is to know what the people in that interaction thought, which we don't have a perspective, but I think the observer perspective is a complementary one.
Mm-hmm. And on this same theme, John McCoy asked a question that introspecting, it kind of feels easy to determine whether you've been kind or rude at any given moment, whether or not you like the answer. And so he's asking whether you have thoughts on why this intuitively feels like an easy task, despite your results showing that people are not especially accurate at doing it.
Why does it intuitively feel like an easy task?
Well, just that it feels like, I think the intuition here is just that introspecting, you seem to have a fairly confident opinion about whether or not you've been kind or rude in any given circumstance, and yet it feels, the results suggest it's maybe not as easy as it seems to people.
Yeah, I think in general, people would think that they know themselves best if you look at most different traits, because we have full knowledge, presumably, of our various motivations. People aren't with us 100% of the time, whereas we ourselves are. But at the same time, this additional information about our own motivations and hopes and dreams and past experiences could get in the way of forming a more objective evaluation of how we're actually acting in the moment. So what I think is happening is that when people are judging how kind they're being in the moment, it feels easy because you know what your motivations were, but others who are observing you may not know those motivations. So they're just forming their judgments more on behavior, which could be more objective if we're interested in behavior.
Yeah, you sort of have differential access to your mental states. Okay, so there's some questions about the change studies. This is a question from David Lydon Staley, and the premise of this question is you're probably not likely to be friends with people that you consider immoral in the first place. So the suggestion here is we might end up with a ceiling effect for desire to change morality traits, which could be partly a function of the fact that you're getting friends to do this. And so I guess the question is, what do you think non-friends would say?
Yeah, I really like this question because I get to show this quote from a participant that I really like. I think it was strange to choose how much I wanted this person to change certain aspects of themselves. If I wanted them to change all these things, then I should just find a new friend. So I think it is true that people have that. I think moral character could be more important in partner selection compared to once you're already in a friendship or a relationship. You may not be as interested. You might not care as much because they've passed this threshold of being morally good enough for you. If we look at the distributions of like how moral people's friends think they are, this is again ordered from least to most morally relevant. You can see that clearly your friends think that you're pretty high on morality, but it's not the case that everyone is rating their friends as being 5 out of 5 on morality. So there is still some room for improvement. And even when I did run some analysis controlling for people's perceptions of how high you are on different traits, we still see that friends aren't as interested in getting you to be more moral. So it's not just all about current levels, but I think that it would be interesting. What would be interesting to know is other people who might be in an out group. For example, I can imagine that liberals would want conservatives to be more moral. Or if you even think about humanity as a whole, do you want the average person to be more moral in the abstract? I think the answer would also be yes. And a third situation where we might want others to be more moral is where there's not much relational mobility. For example, maybe in cultures where you have arranged marriage and there's more taboo against divorce, people might be more interested in improving their partners because it's easy to leave a friendship, but it's not so easy to leave that kind of situation where you're stuck with a person. So these findings about whether we want other people to be more moral, I don't generalize it to that level. I only generalize it to the level of do we want our close others in this in this kind of Western context to be more moral.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think if you're not dealing with close others, the importance of morality might get even more magnified for some of the reasons you're talking about. Another question on the change goals from Julia is, do you think the characteristics we care about others having or changing differ by age? So would the results replicate with older adults or younger adults, or not adults but younger people?
Yeah, I don't know about kids, and I could speculate about this, but it'd be great to hear Julia's thoughts actually on the kid question. But we did replicate these findings, at least for people's own change goals for how they want themselves to change, in a sample of older adults. Where by older, I just mean older than college students. We over-recruited for people who were over 40 and over 50, and we ended up with a mean age of 45. And what we see in this sample of relatively older adults is that the top two change goals, descriptively, are still being less anxious and less depressed, but this is almost matched this now by the desire to become more energetic. So it seems that people do have goals in this developmental context. Older adults seem to have goals that reflect developmental losses or gains, potentially. So they're less energetic in old age, so they want to compensate for that. And these goals to become less anxious and less depressed are also less prominent compared to what we see in younger adults. And instead, some of the people who may have prioritized these traits are now prioritizing other traits in the less morally relevant range of traits. But the key finding is still that older adults are less inclined to improve their more morally relevant traits. So that correlation is still very significant and large.
Mm-hmm. And I've got two more, and then maybe we'll wrap up. So the first one here is from Vida, and she's asking about to what extent the discrepancy between people's self-image and other people's impressions might result from differing goals. So, another person might want you to be more flexible, but for the person in question, they're quite happy being inflexible. So yeah, I guess
I think that's definitely part of what's going on with the worst traits. Where people, something that bothers, when you're saying what a friend's worst trait is, you're most often probably saying something that bothers you about them that may not bother them, but bother that person themselves. So I think that might be part of what's going on. What I thought was interesting in the case of the change goals is just how similar people's goals for themselves were compared to what the goals for their friends were, which suggests that in that context, people seem to be quite interested in improving their close others' well-being, rather than asking their close others to change in ways that would be good for them. I did have some interesting, some additional data for the best and worst traits study, where due to a reviewer request, I'm still kind of wading through these analyses. They're a bit hot off the press. We had additional participants rate each of the best and worst traits that were reported on how desirable these traits would be for a person to have it, or for you to have it, or for a friend to have it. And from that, I was able to compare the desirability for you versus a friend to form a relative index of personal importance. So a trait that is relatively more important to the self would be one that is evaluated as being more extremely desirable or undesirable for the self compared to what it's rated as for a friend. And do I have that? Do I even have this? Okay, I don't have the results up here, but we found I think the finding was that friends seem to be reporting traits that were less personally important compared to what people themselves were reporting. So this would support the idea that people are relying on their own motivations.
Great. And here's the last one. This is from Andy Tan, and he's asking you to comment on how the findings and the proposed intervention relate to concepts of injunctive norms, so approval or disapproval of others, and motivation to comply with others' expectations as described in behavioral change theories like the theory of reasoned action.
Interesting. I haven't really thought about it in terms of that framework. Descriptive norm. So is the idea that people will receive the feedback and interpret it as communicating a norm that they should follow?
Yeah, I guess that would be one way to interpret it. I'm not sure exactly what Andy had in mind, but
I'm the reason why I'm not sure how that would play out is because I think one way to test that would be to have another condition where you where you provide people with feedback that the most commonly reported feedback, because that would communicate what way most people should improve. Rather and compare that to specific feedback for you. But yeah, that's not really a framework that we've been thinking about, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts if you want to follow up.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Sorry for going over time.
No worries. It's not you at all, and it was a lot of material that you covered, and I'm sure that there are lots of other questions. I did paste your email address into the chat, so people can reach out. Thank you so much. You were cool and collected, and even laughing when we reconnected, and so that shows. I mean, I'm so impressed.
Thanks so much, everyone.
I continue to be impressed. So thank you. Thanks to our audience, and thank you, Jeff. And then we'll be back here next week with John Freeman at noon. And we actually have, unfortunately, a little bit of a conflict next week with because we also will be having job talks from new fellowship candidates. So there's a little bit of crossover. So thanks again, everyone. Have a good weekend.